welcome to the 14th episode of RNV Talks, in which we will be discussing many different aspects of the history and culture of the Roma minority. This podcast is released as part of the EUROMIJA project implemented by the Roma National Council of Croatia in the framework of the European Solidarity Corps. Let's see what the team has in store for us today.
Today we're talking about a language that most people in Spain have heard around them, but rarely stop to think about. Caló.
A language connected to Spain's Roma or Gitano communities.
And also a language connected to survival.
Because Caló isn't just disappearing naturally over time. Its decline is tied to centuries of exclusion, discrimination, forced assimilation, and silence.
It is also interesting that many Spaniards actually know Caló words without realizing it, words that entered flamenco culture, slang, everyday speech, but most people don't know where they come from.
Which almost feels symbolic. The culture becomes visible, but the people behind it remain invisible.
That's a very important point for this episode of RNV Talks. Because today, we're not only talking about a language, we're talking about memory, identity, and what happens when an entire community is told, for generations, that their voice doesn't matter. Okay, so let's start simple. What exactly is Caló?
So linguistically speaking, Caló is what's called a para-Romani language. Basically, it means this. Caló preserves a lot of Romani vocabulary, but it uses Spanish grammar and sentence structure.
So it's a blend.
Exactly. The Roma people originally brought Romani languages from northern India centuries ago during migrations into Europe. Over time, in Spain, Roma communities gradually shifted towards speaking Spanish structurally, but they kept many Romani words alive inside that framework.
Although this blending happened under pressure, right?
Very much so.
Because this wasn't just a normal language evolution.
No, it happened in a context where Roma communities were constantly being pushed to assimilate.
And language becomes one of the first casualties when survival depends on blending in.
People often talk about endangered languages as though they simply fade away, like it's natural.
Exactly. But usually there's a reason, either a political, social, or a historical one. Languages disappear because people speaking them are pressured to stop speaking them.
Or made to feel ashamed of speaking them.
That shame is such a huge part of the story, actually, because for many Roma children, speaking Caló or Romani languages wasn't seen as bilingualism. It was seen as something dirty, primitive.
And also schools across Europe played a major role in that.
I think sometimes we forget to acknowledge how deeply language connects to identity, and particularly the survival of the identity during hardships.
Absolutely. Language is emotional. It's family jokes. It's lullabies. It's the way your grandmother speaks to you.
And for communities that have historically been marginalized, language often becomes a protective space.
Almost like a shelter.
Exactly. Roma communities across Europe experienced centuries of persecution, expulsions, restrictions on movement, forced settlement, and violence, and language helped preserve identity under those conditions.
But it also made them more visible to authorities.
Right. Difference becomes suspicious.
Especially in medieval Europe, authorities often viewed Roma communities as outsiders because of their mobility, customs, and language.
And the response was usually control.
Yes, in some kingdoms, Roma were expelled outright. In others, laws restricted how they could travel, dress, work, or organize socially.
And in parts of Eastern Europe, Roma communities were enslaved for centuries.
Sometimes people are still very surprised when they hear it.
Because it's rarely taught, but in places like Romania, Roma slavery lasted for hundreds of years.
Imagine trying to preserve your language under those conditions.
Where even cultural autonomy could be seen as rebellion.
Exactly. And this is why Roma languages across Europe became fragmented over time, not because communities didn't value them, but because survival often required adaptation.
Which creates this heartbreaking contradiction. You preserve parts of your culture to survive, but survival also slowly erodes that culture.
So let's focus specifically on Spain. Roma communities have been here for more than 600 years.
Yes, and from the beginning they were viewed with suspicion.
And what do you think were the main reasons?
Spain during the late Middle Ages was becoming increasingly centralized and rigidly Catholic. Uniformity mattered, religious conformity mattered, social order mattered. And Roma communities represented difference.
Different customs, language, and ways of living.
which authorities often interpreted as dangerous.
Exactly. And over centuries, Spain introduced repeated assimilation policies targeting Roma communities.
And I imagine language was part of that pressure as well.
Definitely. Children learned very quickly that speaking Caló publicly could bring humiliation or punishment.
That fear changes family behavior. Parents stop teaching children openly, grandparents switched languages around outsiders, and words disappear little by little.
Interesting, but that doesn't happen overnight.
No, and that's the thing. Language loss is often gradual and deeply emotional.
And over time, Caló became increasingly fragmented. What survived were scattered expressions, vocabulary, songs, or cultural references.
But not the full fluency for many communities.
No. Today, many Roma families in Spain might recognize Caló words without being able to hold an entire conversation in the language.
Which creates this strange feeling where the language is both alive and disappearing at the same time.
But we also have to talk about the Franco dictatorship, because that period accelerated linguistic repression across Spain.
Absolutely. From 1939 to 1975, Franco's regime aggressively suppressed linguistic diversity. Catalan, Basque, and Galician were banned or heavily restricted in public life.
People were punished for speaking them.
Yes, humiliated, fined, and sometimes even imprisoned.
But even those languages eventually regained institutional recognition after Franco's death.
Yeah, they started appearing at schools, media, and cultural institutions.
Exactly, but Caló never received that same recognition.
And why not?
Because Roma communities remained socially marginalized in ways that the other groups often weren't. Caló lacked institutional support and it remained largely invisible. No public education, no official preservation programs, no meaningful legal recognition.
And invisibility can be just as harmful as outright repression.
Because if institutions pretend your language doesn't exist,
Eventually, society starts believing it.
so what does Caló look like today?
Mostly fragments. Researchers studying Roma communities in southern Spain found that many participants recognized only limited vocabulary, often fewer than 100 words.
But even fragments carry meaning. A single word can hold a memory, a phrase your grandmother used, a nickname, a flamenco lyric.
And Caló still survives strongly in cultural expression, especially music.
Flamenco carries enormous Roma influence. It's everywhere today. Tourism campaigns, films, global music festivals. A lot of people imagine flamenco as something timeless and purely Spanish. But historically, it came from very specific communities.
You're right, it came from Roma, or Gitano communities in Andalusia. Flamenco emerged in marginalized spaces during the 18th century, not in elite theaters, not in royal courts, but in poor neighborhoods, courtyards, family gatherings, and taverns.
And it carried pain. That's important. Flamenco wasn't just entertainment at the beginning, it was expression, survival, and resistance.
You can hear that emotional weight in Cante Hondo, the deep song.
Yes, it makes sense because the themes were exile, persecution, heartbreak, poverty, and endurance. And flamenco itself became this incredible fusion of influences: Roma traditions, Andalusian folk music, Arab sounds, Jewish music tradition, and African rhythms.
Which is why flamenco feels so emotionally layered. It comes from centuries of cultural mixing.
But something changed once flamenco became commercially successful.
Yes, as flamenco gained prestige, dominant institutions began reshaping it.
Including during Franco's dictatorship.
Definitely. Under Franco, flamenco became a nationalist symbol of Spanish identity, but there was a contradiction. The regime celebrated flamenco while many Roma communities still face discrimination and exclusion.
That contradiction still exists today. People love flamenco culture, but often ignore the people behind it. And actually, one of the biggest controversies around flamenco that is a good example of these kinds of contradictions involves a very famous Spanish singer, La Rosalia. As flamenco moved from Roma communities into mainstream institutions and global markets, questions about ownership, representation, and power became increasingly important. In the modern global pop era, artists like Rosalia have played a major role in reintroducing flamenco-inspired styles to international audiences by blending traditional flamenco elements with genres like trap, R&B, and experimental pop, alongside strong visual references to Andalusian and Roma aesthetics. Her success is widely seen as very influential, but it has also sparked some criticism, particularly from some Roma voices, who argue that this modern reinterpretation risks cultural appropriation. They claim that elements of Roma-rooted flamenco both musical, and visual, are often used without enough acknowledgement of the community's historical marginalization and contribution to this art form. Supporters of Rosalia counter that flamenco itself has always been a hybrid art form, shaped by cultural exchange across Roma, Andalusian, Arab, Jewish, and African influences. From this perspective, artistic borrowing and reinvention are actually natural, and restricting them could limit cultural creativity.
I guess overall, the debate is less about whether cultural influence is legitimate and more about inequality. Who gets credit, who profits, and whose history is recognized when a marginalized tradition becomes a global commodity. And now, going back to Caló, you can actually hear it woven into the flamenco tradition. Not only linguistically, but also emotionally. You can almost feel generations speaking through their songs.
After this discussion, the question becomes, can Caló actually be revived?
It's difficult. There's no standardized spelling system, limited documentation, weak intergenerational transmission.
But difficult doesn't mean impossible.
Exactly. Other languages once considered doomed have experienced this kind of revitalization. Welsh, Basque, and Hebrew in a completely different context.
But revival begins with recognition. You can't preserve something society refuses to value.
And maybe preservation doesn't always mean returning to some perfect past.
That's true. Languages evolve. Revival can mean creating new forms of connection, community classes, music projects, digital archives, or storytelling.
And most importantly, it means removing shame.
Because shame is what kills transmission.
Exactly. When children feel proud of a language, they carry it forward. When they're taught to hide it, it disappears.
And losing Caló would mean losing more than words.
It would mean losing memory.
Losing part of Spain itself. Because Roma history is Spanish history, even if Spain has often refused to acknowledge it.
Okay, so Caló survived centuries of persecution, forced assimilation, and silence. The question now is whether survival alone is enough, or whether recognition and preservation will finally follow.
Because languages usually don't just disappear quietly. They disappear when societies decide some voices matter less than the others.
And preserving a language is ultimately about preserving dignity. So thank you all for listening to our little talk on the Caló language in Spain. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.